Hey everyone, this is a piece by an H. Schurer. I think it's Heinz Schurer is his name. And the piece is titled Anton Pannekoek and the Origins of Leninism. This is published in the Slavonic and East European Review in 1963. So here we go. Section 1. When Lenin returned to Petrograd in April 1917, Lenin's political ideas were in some ways very different from what they had been before 1914. Conditions in Europe at war had added new weapons to his intellectual armory and led Lenin to attach great significance to ideas which had previously made no particular impact on his mind. Prominent among the men whose pre-war theories helped to bring new conceptions into his thinking after August 1914 was the Dutchman Anton Pannekoek, who lived from 1873 to 1960. For several years during the war, Pannekoek was one of the handful of people who took Lenin's side in the movements of Simmerwald and Kiental. This not unnaturally made Lenin especially interested in the theories which Pannekoek had put forward in pre-war days, and as a result, some of Pannekoek's ideas found their way into Lenin's thinking as it crystallized during his wartime exile in Switzerland. Pannekoek was a man who distinguished himself in two completely unrelated fields. Pannekoek is best known as an astronomer of international repute, whose book on the history of astronomy was translated into English in 1961. But during the first 2 decades of the century, Pannekoek played an important part in the labor movement of both the Netherlands and Germany, particularly significant for their impact on Lenin's thinking after 1914, are his pre-war writings reflecting his experience of German social democracy. Between the end of the 19th century and 1914, the German Social Democratic Party, which remained the model party of the Second International, was dominated by the conflict between the revisionists and the Orthodox. After the Russian Revolution of 1905, an extreme left wing gradually emerged in the Orthodox Marxist camp. It tried to apply the lessons of the Russian Revolution to the German social democratic movement and was led to advocate new forms of political struggle. In contrast to most German socialists, who continued to rely entirely on parliamentary work and trade union organizations, this left wing pinned its main hopes on mass actions such as political mass strikes. The same two currents also existed in the labor movements of other countries. After the Russian Revolution of 1905, an extreme left-wing group of intellectuals formed in the Dutch Socialist Party and attacked the leaders of the party majority for relying too much on parliamentary work. Among them were writers of national eminence, like Hermann Gorder and Henrietta Rolandholst, and also Anton Pannekoek, who was already showing promise as a young astronomer. In 1907, the group founded a journal called Tribune as the organ of the extreme revolutionary left wing, and fought so bitterly against the party leadership that at the beginning of 1909, its members were expelled from the party. This led them to found a new party of their own, but it remained a small minority within the Dutch socialist movement. The case of the, quote, tribunists prompted one of Lenin's interventions at meetings of the Second International. In November 1909, the International Socialist Bureau had before it an application for the new Dutch Revolutionary Socialist Party to affiliate to the Second International, and had two motions to consider. One of them, which was backed by the German Social Democrats, supported the application. The other, which was proposed by Victor Adler of Austria, favored the majority group in the Dutch socialist movement. Lenin spoke emphatically for the application and was at one with the official spokesman of the German party in backing the, quote, tribunists, but it was Adler's motion which was carried. The bitterness between the majority and the minority in the Dutch socialist movement in the years before 1914 is reminiscent of conditions in the Russian and Polish movements during the same period. It also anticipated the situation which arose in the German movement after the 4th of August 1914, when it was no longer possible to contain political differences within the same organizational framework. Pannekoek during this period had one foot in the Dutch movement and one in the German. From 1906, Pannekoek worked as a journalist in the service of German social democracy and lived in Berlin and later in Bremen. After about 1908, Karl Radek, a native of Austrian Poland and a member of Rosa Luxemburg's Polish Social Democratic movement, It should be noted that Rosa Luxemburg hated Karl Radek. Also lived in Bremen, and the influence of Pannekoek and Radek made Bremen the center of an extreme left-wing group which was near to becoming, in the war years, a group of Leninists on German soil. Already before the war, Radek drew close to Lenin, especially after 1912, when the split in Rosa Luxemburg's Polish party left Rosa Luxemburg and Tyszko on one side, and Lenin, Radek, and Hennesky on the other. Use Tyszko. I'm not seeing anything good for that. Anyway. Where am I? Already before the war, Radek drew close to Lenin, especially after 1912 when the split in Rosa Luxemburg's Polish party left Rosa Luxemburg and Tyszko on one side and Lenin, Radek, and Hennesky on the other. The repercussions of this Polish factional split put Radek in an extremely difficult position within the German party and brought demands for Radek's expulsion. It was Pannekoek who defended Radek against his accusers at the Chemnitz Party Congress in 1912, and when Radek was eventually expelled in 1913, the two men were drawn even closer by the common experience of their expulsion from the great official labor movements. The publication of Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital in 1913 deepened the rift between Rosa Luxemburg's group in Berlin and the Pannekoek-Radek group. When Pannekoek published a sharp criticism of Rosa Luxemburg in the Bremen Party paper and condemned Luxemburg's basic thesis as incorrect, Lenin backed him fully. In view of the relations between the Pannekoek-Radek group in Bremen and the Bolshevik Party, with Radek as the connecting link, it is not surprising that in a letter to Hennesky in 1913, Lenin urged that he should introduce to Pannekoek, as a prominent leftist, the Bolshevik guest delegate to the German Social Democratic Congress in Jena. Lenin evidently studied Pannekoek's writings of this period with great interest, but the real impact on his thinking was only to show itself in the war years. In 1909, Pannekoek published a pamphlet on tactical differences within the labor movement, which appeared under the imprint of the official publisher of the Hamburg Social Democratic Party organization. Its tone was sharpened by the experience of the split in the Dutch Socialist Party, which had occurred in the same year owing to the unusual bitterness of the antagonism between left and right in the Dutch labor movement. Antagonism between left and right was acute enough in German social democracy, but in Germany the fighting went on within the framework of a single organized movement. Much of Pannekoek's pamphlet covered familiar ground, the common world of ideas of left-wing Marxism in pre-war Western Europe, with its stress on the need to prepare for a new age of mass actions and warnings against excessive reliance on parliaments and trade unions. What was new in Pannekoek's discussion of the revisionist deviation from the orthodox revolutionary Marxist course was Pannekoek's attempt to penetrate through the ideology of the revisionist heresy to the revisionist heresy's social roots. For the first time, a writer in the Marxist camp laid down that the tactical differences between left and right in the labor movement sprang from the class structure of the movement. Pannekoek suggested that any large mass movement of opposition and protest developing in the conditions which prevailed in Imperial Germany was bound to be a coalition of several social groupings of several social classes. Quote, the followers of social democracy, Pannekoek wrote, quote, the members of the party form no homogeneous mass with identical views, ideas, and aspirations. Different classes and groups with, in some cases, different interests are covered by this name and by this party label. If these interests are held in common on a temporary or permanent basis, these groups are welded together, but interests which differ, or even mutually hostile, will lead to conflicts. This battle of interest then assumes the form of tactical differences within the party. This battle of interests then assumes the form of tactical differences within the party. End quote. Pannekoek. If social democracy was the political exponent of several social groups associated in a common struggle against a common adversary, and not a unified association of like-minded people, it is only to be expected that in this coalition of different groups, each group would try to press its own particular interest. The core of the movement consisted of the workers in large-scale industrial enterprises. In the mass actions to come, their power would be decisive. Centered round them were other social groups which supported social democracy in parliamentary elections. Pannekoek enumerated and analyzed these groups. Pannekoek distinguished first the, quote, traditional middle classes, end quote, composed of small proprietors in the countryside and independent craftsmen in the towns. Their economic existence was threatened by capitalism, and they were being increasingly proletarianized. They therefore represented groups which belonged to the past. Pannekoek next singled out classes created only recently by the new economic developments of his time, in particular the class of white-collar workers, whom the Germans termed the, quote, new middle class. Thirdly, and most important of all, Pannekoek pointed to the rise of an upper layer within the working class itself, quote, these groups of the industrial proletariat, end quote, Pannekoek wrote, quote, which by powerful organizations have achieved a privileged position, higher wages and shorter working hours, and form a kind of labor aristocracy, did not feel the same urge for the overthrow of capitalism as the lower layers of the working class, Their ideal is a gradual rise to better economic conditions. Their views approximate to those of the traditional middle classes, and their condition resembles that of the lower layers of the new middle classes, end quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek argued that a serious contrast of interest existed between the, quote, traditional middle classes and the labor aristocracy among the workers on the one hand, and the industrial proletariat on the other. It was therefore not surprising to find an intense conflict of ideas within the social democratic movement as well. Quote, revisionism, Pannekoek said, quote, represents the interests of these traditional middle classes and the interests of the highly skilled labor aristocracy in contrast to the interests of the masses of the industrial proletariat, end quote. Pannekoek. The political battles in the social democratic movement were based on the clash of economic interests of the various classes which the party represented. Hence the violence and passion with which they were waged. Particularly interesting from the point of view of future developments was Pannekoek's suggestion that the paramount importance attached to organization, particularly trade union organization, and the need for keeping it intact, could be a factor which weakened the working class in the class struggle and produced a tendency towards accommodation to the status quo. The extent and strength of class organization, on which the German socialists prided themselves, had thus altered the function which organization fulfilled. What had begun as an expression of protest against capitalism was now serving to bridge the gulf between the proletariat and the capitalists, and led to the embourgeoisement of the working class. To regard a mass party like German social democracy as a coalition wing of warring interests and ideologies held together by common antagonism to the political structure of imperial Germany, implied that the coalition might break apart in times of crisis and strain, particularly as the issues at stake were not simply theoretical niceties, but real class interests and the clashes between them. To an orthodox Marxist like Pannekoek, the labor aristocracy thus became a veritable bête noire. For him, a split between left and right would be a split between the mass of the industrial proletariat and a small minority of privileged labor aristocrats. New section, Section 2. After 1909, when Pannekoek published his pamphlet against the background of the bitter struggle in the Dutch Labour Party and the expulsion from it of Pannekoek himself and his friends, the process of differentiation in the German social democratic movement quickened. Pannekoek and Radek formed the Bremen group of extreme left-wingers. Rosa Luxemburg, Tyschko, and Marszalewski formed the Berlin group of left radicals. In 1909, the struggle, as Pannekoek's pamphlet had delineated it, was still between orthodox Marxism and revisionism, with each of the two currents representing the appropriate social classes. But in 1910, Rosa Luxemburg and Kautsky clashed over the use of the mass strike to win universal suffrage in Prussia. From now onwards, German social democracy had three wings, not two, and the party majority with Kautsky as its ideologue had to turn its guns against the left extremists of the Berlin and Bremen groups, as well as against the revisionists. The result was a series of polemics in the columns of Neue Zeit between Kautsky on the one hand and Rosa Luxemburg, Radek, and Pannekoek on the other. But the Berlin group never used the theory of the labor aristocracy in these polemics. This remained Pannekoek's own special contribution. Two main issues arose between Kautsky and his assailants. These were the nature of imperialism and the role of mass action in the struggle to combat. Historians of the German social democratic movement during these years have to use terms taken from the history of religion, such as, quote, an apocalyptic mood, and, quote, expectation of the parousia to come, end quote, when they try to describe the emotional world in which the left radicals lived. It is therefore hardly surprising to find that one of these theoretical tournaments between Pannekoek and Kautsky in 1912 greatly influenced Lenin's thinking just before and during the early days of the February Revolution of 1917. The mood of the extreme left-wingers in German social democracy in the years immediately before 1914 and their firm conviction of tremendous upheavals to come were not unlike Lenin's mood and conviction when news of the February Revolution first reached him in his exile in Switzerland. The controversy between Pannekoek and Kautsky in 1912 arose out of differences in their evaluation of mass action and parliamentary work in the conditions of the time. Only the points relevant to the future need to be mentioned here. Pannekoek envisaged a long, drawn-out battle between the working class and the bourgeoisie, which would cover a whole period characterized by a series of graduated mass movements. By this, Pannekoek meant successive waves of political strikes. Pannekoek believed that the collision between the state of the bourgeoisie and these graduated waves of proletarian mass action would be a lengthy process. For him, the essence of the transfer of power to the working class was not the gradual attainment of a majority in Parliament and the concentration of power in Parliament, but the gradual erosion of the bourgeois state and the simultaneous development of a proletarian counterstate as a result of series of mass movements. Quote, the essence of the revolution, end quote, Pannekoek wrote, quote, is the destruction of the political power apparatus of the bourgeois state by the political power apparatus of the proletariat, end quote. Pannekoek. In the process of revolution, the bourgeois state apparatus would thus be destroyed, not taken over. The process would be long drawn out. The revolution would be achieved not by a single blow, but by the gradual dissolution of the political forces of the capitalist state and the gradual building up of the power of the working class. This idea that the fundamental task is the gradual destruction of the existing state organization by the socialist revolution was wholly alien to the traditional thinking of German social democracy. Pannekoek also argued that existing working-class organizations could not accomplish this task. To some extent, they still reflected the stability of the capitalist society of the day. The degree of integration into a powerful fighting organization depended on the total transformation of the psychology of the working class in the smelting furnace of the socialist revolution. This process would create new forms of organizations, new organs of political power, completely new institutions. Quote, at the end of the revolutionary process, end quote, Pannekoek maintained, quote, nothing is left, end quote, of the material power of the ruling class. Quote, the whole working class has become a highly organized class, determining its own fate with clear consciousness. It's fit to rule and can begin to organize production. Let me repeat that last quote. Quote, the whole working class has become a highly organized class, determining the whole working class's own fate with clear consciousness. Is fit to rule and can begin to organize production, end quote. Pannekoek. Though Pannekoek frequently referred to the experiences of the Russian Revolution of 1905, Pannekoek spoke only of political and economic mass strikes and emphasized the possibility of great spontaneous outbursts of unorganized masses. At the same time, Pannekoek was by no means unaware that the existence of large organized movements in the West differentiated the coming socialist revolution of the 20th century from the revolutions of the 19th century. In all these forecasts, Pannekoek kept to large abstractions. Pannekoek's only reference to the forms of struggle was to the mass strikes in Russia, and Pannekoek deliberately made no attempt to forecast the kind of political organization which the struggling working class was likely to evolve. Pannekoek left it instead to the creative powers of the working class of the future, since its character and the nature of its organization were certain to be completely transformed in the process of the socialist revolution. Pannekoek made no reference to Marx's writings on the Paris Commune of 1871 or to the Russian Soviets of 1905. Pannekoek probably ignored the first as belonging to an early phase of the socialist movement, and the second as typical of a backward, primitive country where no large-scale working-class organizations existed, and where an unorganized working class had thrown up Soviets for want of something better. After the war, when Rosa Luxemburg addressed the founding Congress of the German Communist Party at the end of 1918, Pannekoek envisaged the future in Germany in the same kind of terms as Pannekoek had envisaged it in 1912, a series of gradual mass actions in the form of political as well as economic strikes, which would lead to the formation of a proletarian counterstate and the simultaneous erosion of the foundations of the existing state. Kautsky was obviously taken aback by Pannekoek's conceptions, which were formulated in 1912 when Imperial Germany was still at the height of her power. Kautsky followed the line which he had adopted in his controversies with Rosa Luxemburg since 1910 and charged Pannekoek with mechanically translating the Russian experience of 1905 to the completely different conditions of Western Europe. Waves of lengthy mass strikes were possible under special conditions in a backward country like Russia, but were out of the question in Germany under prevailing conditions. Pannekoek's basic idea of the destruction, the breaking, and the smashing of the bourgeois state apparatus seemed to Kautsky to show complete confusion of thought. Quote, "Hitherto," Kautsky wrote, quote, "the difference between social democrats and anarchists consisted simply in this, that the first wanted to conquer state power, the other to destroy state power. Pannekoek advocates both aims at the same time," end quote. Kautsky also derided and dismissed as, quote, "social alchemy," the further ideas of the spiritual transformation of the working class into the process of revolution, of which Pannekoek had made so much. For him, the aims maintained a majority in Parliament. For Kautsky, the aims remained a majority in Parliament, full powers to Parliament, large-scale nationalization by a socialist majority in a democratically elected Parliament. If the entire state apparatus had been destroyed by mass action, as Pannekoek thought, how on earth could all this be achieved? Kautsky demanded. Pannekoek had broken entirely new ground with his theory of a labor aristocracy as the social basis of reformism within social democracy, and with Pannekoek's suggestion that in the great struggle to come, new political institutions would very likely be created in place of existing institutions which are unsuitable to the needs of the new society of the future. Among the other members of the extreme left of the social democratic movement, Rosa Luxemburg never tried to explain the existence of the reformist current by linking it to any social group. It was not an idea which belonged to Rosa Luxemburg's theoretical armory, nor did Luxemburg suggest the likelihood that new institutional forms would be thrown up in the great struggle of the coming epoch. The references in her writings to the St. Petersburg Soviet of 1905 are concerned with trade union problems, not with the political structure of a socialist society. New section, Section 3. It takes a real effort of the imagination to appreciate the shattering effect of the deep shock which Lenin experienced when the German Social Democratic Party voted for war credits on the 4th of August, 1914. Not only had the German Party been the teacher of Russian social democracy, but Germany's whole development from 1870 to 1914 had seemed to the Russian Marxists to provide historical proof of the correctness of Marx's predictions. Economic progress, rapid industrialization, the flow of a large part of the rural population into the towns where it had been transformed into an industrial proletariat, and the seemingly irresistible rise of German social democracy from a splinter party to a mass party backed by a third of the population had all appeared to bear out Marx's prophecies that capitalism would be its own grave digger. But the events of August 1914 shattered this image once and for all. The revolutionary determination of Lenin and Lenin's associates still remained unshaken, but the link which they had seen between economic progress and their hopes of revolution had now snapped, In their view, yesterday's idol, the Social Democratic Party of the most advanced capitalist country of Europe, had collapsed and betrayed their faith in it, while the socialists of backward peasant countries like Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania had kept firmly to a policy which Lenin considered to be the only possible socialist line in war conditions. The explanation for what had occurred lay ready at hand in Pannekoek's sociological theory of the labor aristocracy. The socialist movements of the highly developed countries like Germany, France, and England had allowed themselves to be captured by the revisionists, who were the exponents of the labor aristocracy, as the reasons which were held responsible for the patriotic attitude of the socialist parties were gradually elaborated. New elements were added to this basic concept. The synthesis of these various ideas was destined to form a central part of orthodox Leninism. The main idea was that revisionism or reformism was linked with a definite social layer of the working class. This had come from Pannekoek. In Leninist terminology, revisionism was dubbed, quote, opportunism, and was regarded by Lenin as very definitely the root of, quote, social patriotism and, quote, social chauvinism. Other elements came to be grouped around Pannekoek's initial thesis. Scattered passages in the correspondence of Engels with Kautsky and Bebel had tried to explain the attachment of the British working class to the Liberal Party at the end of the 19th century by pointing to Britain's colonial wealth, which had supposedly been used to bribe and corrupt some sections of the British workers. Footnote. Engels to Kautsky, 12th of September 1882, quote, you ask me what the English workers think of colonial politics, exactly the same as they think of politics in general, viz. What the bourgeois think. The workers participate joyfully in the fruits of the British monopoly of the world market and colonial empire. End quote. See Marx and Engels Briefe and A. Bebel, W. Liebknecht, Karl Kautsky, und andere. See also Engels to Bebel on the 30th of August 1883, quote, a real working class movement will only arise in England when the workers come to realize that the British world market monopoly has come to an end. The participation in this monopoly is the economic basis of the political nullity of the English working class. Trailing behind the bourgeoisie in the economic exploitation of this monopoly, in the political field they trail behind the Liberal Party. End quote. End footnote. As imperialism had begun to be widely discussed in Marxist circles in the years before the war, these remarks of Engels about colonial wealth of Britain were now taken to apply to all the advanced European countries with either colonial empires or a favored position in the world market. Their privileged position was held to bring them extra profits with which to bribe and corrupt a privileged minority of the working class and create the kind of labor aristocracy to which Pannekoek had referred. In 1911, Robert Michel, a former social democrat who was later to become attracted for a time by syndicalism, had published a book entitled Zur Soziologie des Parteiwesens in der modernen Demokratie, in which Michel had shown, with a wealth of supporting material, that the labor bureaucracy in the European labor movement was a force whose very function made it tend to dominate the movement, seek an accommodation with the status quo, and swing the movement to the right. This tendency had shown itself first in the bureaucracy of the trade unions, and had now spread to the party bureaucracy as well. Shortly after the outbreak of the war, Pannekoek published an article in the Bolshevik journal, Communist, denouncing the veneration of organization and giving it as one of the reasons why German social democracy had changed front. Zinoviev, who was one of Lenin's closest collaborators in Switzerland during the war years, referred extensively to both Pannekoek and Michel in an ambitious book, one chapter of which tried to propound a coherent theory of the social roots of opportunism in the labor movement. Zinoviev wrote the book in 1915-16 and published it in Petrograd in 1917, soon after the October Revolution, under the title The War and the Crisis of Socialism. In it, Zinoviev recalled how Pannekoek had suggested that revolutionary fervor might be weakened as well as fortified by the rise and strengthening of organizations whose character, quote, reflected the stability of the present-day order, end quote, and how he had argued that pressure from strong organizations helped to transform certain sections of the working class into a labor aristocracy. He pointed out how Michel's had exemplified the role of the labor bureaucracy and shown its tendency towards oligarchy and towards accommodation with the capitalist system. He also quoted from the article in Communist, in which Pannekoek had denounced the cult of organization in German social democracy and blamed it for helping to cause the movement's change of course. Once this sociological rationalization had been found of why the situation had developed differently from what had been expected, the next step was to urge that the ideological exponents of the labor aristocracy and the labor bureaucracy should be separated from the ideological exponents of the true revolutionary proletariat, whatever might be the temporary relations of forces and influence. Given the theory that the working class movement was a coalition of social groups, it was not unlikely that in times of crisis this coalition would fall apart. Lenin, Pannekoek, and Radek all saw clearly and correctly that the Second International would not recover from the 4th of August 1914. In this respect, their views proved to be more acute than those of many of their contemporaries in the socialist camp. The earliest official statement of the Bolshevik Party on the war was the resolution of the Berlin Conference of February and March 1915. Lenin himself drafted it. He indicated his full acceptance of the Pannekoek-Michel theory of the social roots of, quote, opportunism, quote, social patriotism, and, quote, social chauvinism, quote, certain strata of the laboring class, end quote. The resolution of the Berlin Conference 1915 said, quote, parenthesis, the bureaucracy of the labor movement and the labor aristocracy have received crumbs of the profits made from the exploitation of colonies and from the privileged position of their country on the world market, end parenthesis, and also petty bourgeois associates within the socialist parties have become the chief social support of these tendencies and the channels of bourgeois influence within the proletariat, end quote. From this, it went on to deduce the need for a radical split in the whole European working class movement. But the call for a split was still limited to Lenin and Lenin's tiny handful of Simmervolt left-wingers. It was made in the teeth of opposition from many other left-wingers and had no practical significance at the time. The German Social Democratic Party was the only important party which split substantially during the war, and it was the patriotic majority and not the left extremists who caused the split. The dividing line was not between revolutionary and non-revolutionary, but between patriot and pacifist. And even Bernstein, the venerable founder of revisionism, was included among the opposition leaders whom the majority expelled. But it is significant from the point of view of theory that in 1916, when Radek, who was one of Lenin's closest wartime associates, urged his German followers to take the initiative in splitting the German party, he referred explicitly to Pannekoek's pamphlet of 1909 and followed its enumeration of the strata which formed the social basis of reformism. There's a footnote that I missed. Lenin, in a letter from Berna to Shliapnikov on the 27th of October 1914, quote, the only one to tell the truth to the workers, was Pannekoek, Pannekoek's words to the effect that if the leaders of the International, which was killed by the opportunists and by Kautsky, now gather an attempt to, quote, mend the cracks, their efforts will have no significance whatsoever. These words are the only socialist words. This is the truth, end quote. Lenin. End footnote. Radek completely endorsed Pannekoek's analysis, merely adding his own suggestion that the labor aristocracy and the labor bureaucracy were closely linked by the similarity of their origins. In Radek's view, the events of 1914 had proved the falsity of the old idea of the extreme German left that pressure from the masses would push the leaders forward. A split in the movement was inevitable, given the profound social differentiation within the working class. The same arguments were to be heard after 1917 when the Comintern was founded. Far more immediate importance attached to a further implication of the views which Radek expressed about the labor aristocracy. This labor aristocracy was typical of the advanced capitalist countries, and as 1914 had shown, it had captured the labor movement. But countries also existed where the labor aristocracy was insignificant, and what happened there? Quote, in Italy and Russia, end quote, Radek wrote, quote, the group of privileged workers is very small, and for this reason the great majority of the Socialist Party has remained faithful to socialism, end quote. Radek. The implication was, particularly in view of the reference to Russia, that the development of capitalism created conditions for the reformist corruption of the working class in the advanced countries, while the less advanced countries remained untainted by the reformist position. Economic progress had meant that capitalism in the advanced countries had built stabilizers to ensure its survival. But if economic advance and reformist corruption go hand in hand, so do economic backwardness and revolutionary socialism. Thus, in the period after 1914, when belief in the great revolutionary German Social Democratic Party lay shattered, the theory of labor aristocracy forms the connecting link with the idea that socialism might come first in backward Russia. In lines written in 1919 under the impression of the recent assassination of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, Lenin was to formulate this idea with great clarity. Quote, England served as an example of a country in which the bourgeoisie ... created the most bourgeois upper stratum of the proletariat. For several decades, the advanced capitalist country proved to be backward in regard to the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat. ... Then hegemony in the international passed to Germany. In the 70s of the 19th century, when Germany was economically behind England and France, when Germany finally surpassed these two countries economically, i.e., in the second decade of the 20th century, a handful of arch scoundrels, the filthiest blackguards who had sold themselves to the capitalists, ... the most revolting executioners risen from the ranks of the workers to enlist in the service of the monarchy and the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie, were found to be at the head of the Marxist Workers' Party in Germany, which had been a model for the whole world. End quote. Lenin. In this passage, Lenin sums up the basic concept of the connection between the revolutionary spirit and economic backwardness on the one hand, and the reformist spirit and economic progress on the other. Lenin naturally realized that this concept flatly contradicted the predictions of Marx. Lenin therefore found it necessary to add, quote, world history marches inevitably towards the dictatorship of the proletariat, but it does not move towards this goal by a smooth, straightforward, and direct road, end quote. Lenin. Engels had noted a connection between economic progress and reformism, and between backwardness and socialist militancy as early as 1884, and found it, quote, curious. The implications for Russia were clear and may help to explain why Lenin had rejected Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution in pre-war days, when he still believed firmly in Kautsky German social democracy and in the connection between economic progress and social advance. But after 1914, when his idols lay shattered, Lenin gradually came round to Trotsky's idea, which linked economic backwardness with revolution. At the 5th Congress of the Comintern in 1924, when Heinrich Brandler was defending his leadership of the unsuccessful attempt at a communist revolution in Germany in 1923, Heinrich Brandler also argued from this same standpoint, which originated with Radek and Pannekoek. Quote, in Russia in 1917, end quote, Brandler insisted, almost pathetically, quote, there was no labor aristocracy, end quote. And that quote is from E.H. Carr, History of Soviet Russia, Volume 4, published in 1954. There's a footnote that I missed. Engels to Kautsky, 8th of November 1884, quote, for the first time in power, a solid workers' party, bracket, i.e. German social democracy, end bracket, presents itself as a political power, ... It is curious. What helps our cause most is the retarded industrial conditions of Germany. In England and France, the transition to industrialization is more or less completed. The conditions in which the proletariat exist have already become stable, end quote. Engels to Kautsky, 8th of November, 1884, end footnote. When Lenin eventually accepted the theory of permanent revolution, it was in the firm belief that the impact of a socialist upheaval in Russia would be so tremendous that even the power of the labor aristocracy would be swept away by a general mass revolt against the horrors of war, but it would be an unorganized and elemental revolt, as no revolutionary organizations existed to lead it. The basis of Lenin's strategy in April 1917 thus becomes clear. What he did was to link his acceptance of the theory of the socialist revolution, that a socialist revolution would start first in a backward country like Russia, with the idea that in advanced countries like Germany, the socialist revolution would be stimulated by Russia's example and would take the form of a spontaneous uprising of the masses in defiance of the conservative influence of the traditional leadership and organization. In all this, Lenin was not as far removed from reality as Lenin seems to have been now. The October Revolution soon stimulated a huge international mass strike movement in the countries of the Central Powers, in which political and economic motives were mingled, and which developed entirely against the wishes of the traditional organizations, which, with the rank and file taking the lead. It was a unique international action uniting Budapest, Vienna, and Berlin in the kind of great spontaneous movement which Lenin had expected when making the October Revolution in Russia. New section. Section 4. This idea of an elemental uprising of the masses was in the forefront of Lenin's mind during the early weeks of 1917, when Lenin began to collect material for an essay on the Marxist conception of the state under the stimulus of an article by Bukharin. After the 4th of August 1914, when the traditional parties and trade unions had shown that they were clearly unfitted to organize a protest movement against war, a spontaneous elemental movement was the only form of protest which could be envisaged. When Marx discussed the Paris Commune, Marx too had put all his emphasis on the creative action of the Paris working class and had paid scant regard to the role of the revolutionary leaders. During his examination of the Marxist literature on these problems in the winter of 1916 to 1917, Lenin realized that the idea of the destruction of the bourgeois state and its replacement by a new type of government machinery, which Lenin regarded as Marx's central contribution, had been plainly restated by Pannekoek in his controversy with Kautsky in 1912. When Lenin was making notes on the controversy at the beginning of 1917, chiefly to expose Kautsky's, quote, betrayal of Marxism in the course of it, Lenin's sympathies were plainly with Pannekoek. By linking the experience of the Paris Commune, as Marx had described it, and the Russian Soviets of 1905, Lenin reached conclusions which approximated very closely to ideas of direct democracy, of self-government of the masses without intermediary political organs. In 1912, Pannekoek had advanced the idea of a proletarian counterstate fighting the existing order over a long period of time in a series of graduated mass movements taking the form of mass strikes. But Lenin's notes indirectly criticized Pannekoek's exclusive reliance on the mass strike by stressing the possibility of an armed uprising, with explicit reference to the Moscow Rising of December 1905. Lenin made his notes in January and February 1917 and developed them into State and Revolution during August and September. Their tenor is unmistakable, reliance on the creative potentialities of the working class masses. They make hardly any mention of the role of the party, which has always seemed puzzling. If Lenin's notes are read against the background of the period, when all that Lenin could hope for was that the masses in Western Europe would rise without and against their traditional leaders, Lenin's emphasis on the spontaneous creative energies of the masses becomes intelligible. In this context, Lenin's stress on the Soviets of the 1905 revolution, which have been an outstanding example of a spontaneous, unorganized movement without direction by political and trade union organizations, clearly fits the general pattern of his thinking during these months. Whether Lenin was correct or not in his interpretation of Marx is irrelevant. What matters is what weapons were ready in his ideological armory when he returned to Russia in April 1917. Once Lenin reached Petrograd, Lenin immediately applied to the situation which had arisen after the downfall of Tsarism. Lenin's idea that the new proletarian state would be born as a creative act of the masses, what had still been an academic exercise in Lenin's examination of the Kautsky-Pannekoek controversy now became a practical issue of crucial importance. The rise of the Petrograd Soviet as a, quote, counterstate to the provisional government fitted in completely with the Pannekoek thesis of a proletarian counter-government wrestling with the bourgeois government. The ideas which Lenin had formed during his study of Marxist texts and the Kautsky-Pannekoek controversy of 1912 no longer remained theoretical speculations. Instead, Lenin promptly applied them to the situation which he found in Russia in April 1917. Lenin now accepted Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. With its burning faith in the revolutionary creative powers of the Russian proletariat masses, and its belief that the impact of an upheaval in Russia would break the crust of organizational conservatism in German social democracy. At the same time, he applied the Pannekoek theory of the two governments, each of them representing a different class, locked in a struggle which would lead to destruction of one and the triumph of the other. The Soviets against the provisional government was the Russian version in 1917 of Pannekoek's forecast of 1912. In a lecture on Russia, which Lenin gave in Zurich in March 1917, just after the February Revolution, Lenin had brought into his discussion of the new situation all his recent ideas on the Paris Commune, the Soviets of 1905, the Kautsky-Pannekoek controversy of 1912, and the Soviet of 1917. Lenin had applied these ideas to the tasks now facing the movement, which Lenin defined as the establishment of direct rule by armed and organized workers. Trotsky, who had been so closely identified with the Soviets of 1905, reached similar conclusions while still in exile in New York. It was on the basis of their newly found agreement on the perspectives of the approaching Russian and West European revolutions and the crucial role which the Soviets would play in them that Lenin and Trotsky formed their alliance in 1917. In September 1918, when Radek drafted his foreword to Bukharin's attempt to give a systematic account of the communist doctrine, he proudly claimed Pannekoek as a begetter of the Leninist theory of the state. Quote, "It was often asked," end quote, Radek said, quote, "how capitalist democracy and capitalist democracy's parliamentary institutions would be transformed into institutions of the victorious proletariat. When Pannekoek, the most clear-headed theorist of West European socialism, gave the answer to the effect that capitalism would have to be destroyed even in capitalism's democratic forms, and that new institutions of the working class would have to be created in the fire of the proletarian revolution, Pannekoek was accused of anarchism by Karl Kautsky. However, correct Pannekoek's answer was, it was an incomplete answer. ... Pannekoek did not say what kind of institutions the proletariat would have to create in order to carry out and ensure its final victory," end quote. Karl Radek. Thus, at the end of 1918, Karl Radek hailed Pannekoek, his old comrade in arms of Bremen, as one of the forerunners of Leninism. Footnote. Quote, "The revolutionary proletariat must at once oppose its revolutionary organs, the Soviets of the workers, soldiers, and peasants' deputies, to the executive organs of the provisional government. In the struggle, the proletariat, heading the revolutionary masses, must aim at the conquest of power as its leading target," end quote. I'm not sure who that quote is from, but the quote is from was reprinted in Trotsky's that's Trotsky, reprinted in his My Life, I think. I'm not sure. No, it's not My Life. I'm not sure what it's from, but it's Trotsky. Anyway, end footnote. New section. Section 5. A few months later, a controversy arose between Radek on the one side and Pannekoek and Gorder on the other, which led within 2 years to a parting of the ways between Lenin, Radek, and the Comintern and the two Dutch Marxists. After the October Revolution and the creation of the Comintern, Pannekoek was one of the first to join the Third International as a founder of the Communist Party of Holland. At the same time, Pannekoek resumed his political work in Germany, but soon after the end of the war, Pannekoek clashed with the leadership of official communism over the issue of communist participation in parliamentary elections and trade unions. Together with Pannekoek's old friend Gorder of Tribune Days, Pannekoek was among the leading exponents of the trend, which Lenin denounced in his pamphlet of 1920 as, quote, "ultra-leftism, the infantile disease of communism," end quote. For all practical purposes, this controversy was settled in Lenin's favor in 1920 and 1921 and is irrelevant in the present context. Of much greater interest are the views which Pannekoek expressed in his polemics against Radek and official German communism. In the middle of 1918, his friend Herman Gorter had published a pamphlet in Amsterdam entitled The World Revolution. In it, he had wholeheartedly supported the Bolshevik Revolution, but had also been at pains to emphasize the profound differences which were bound to exist between Russian and West European communism, owing to the differences in the position of the peasantry, which was an ally of the revolution in Russia and a conservative force in Western Europe, even if the working class in Western Europe were imbued with a real revolutionary spirit. Gorter maintained that it would still have to fight its battle alone and face a much stronger capitalism and a much stronger state organization than had existed in Russia. In a pamphlet written under the name of K. Horner and published by the Comintern in Moscow early in 1920, Pannekoek proceeded from Gorter's assumption to a highly original interpretation of the true character of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks had made their revolution in Russia on the basic assumption that the socialist revolution would spread to the advanced countries of Western Europe. Pannekoek now had the courage to tell them that this basic assumption had proved to be false. The West European working class had accommodated itself to existing conditions, and decades would pass before a militant revolutionary spirit could possibly arise again in its ranks. Pannekoek drew the appropriate conclusions without equivocation. Quote, "The communist world revolution is not properly understood if it is regarded only from the viewpoint of Western Europe. Russia is not only the eastern part of Europe, but to a far greater extent, geographically, as well as economically and politically, the western part of Asia. Russia, too, becomes a colony of West European capital, ... While the Russian working class worked under similar conditions to those of Western Europe, which led to a community of Marxist convictions, Russia, in her economic situation, was the Western empire of the Asiatic empires, ... The Russian Revolution is the beginning of the great revolt of Asia against West European capital. Hitherto, we have only been considering its impact on Western Europe, but even more important is its effect on the East. The problems of Asia dominate Soviet policy almost more than the questions of Europe. ... The cause of Asia is the cause of humanity." End quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek predicted that communism's best chances would be found in underdeveloped countries where the stresses and strains of the impact of industrialization within a non-democratic political framework would lead to large-scale social upheavals. Quote, "New countries where the masses are not poisoned by bourgeois ideas, where by the beginnings of industrial development their minds are shaken out of the old lethargy and a socialist community spirit arises, where the raw materials are available to be used by the most advanced techniques and new forms of production, replacing those which are outmoded, where the pressure from above is strong enough to develop a fighting spirit, but where no all-powerful bourgeoisie can prevent such a movement. Such countries will be the centers of the new communist world. The Russian Revolution is the first of a series. These conditions also prevail more or less in other Eastern countries, in India and in China." End quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek's bold forecast that the Russian Revolution might have more meaning for the underdeveloped colonial and semi-colonial peasant countries of the East than for the advanced West is of renewed interest today, when many of these countries are in the process of revolutionary change. Old controversies may soon become the dead lumber of history, but as often happens in the history of ideas, suggestions may be put forward in their margins which acquire interest and significance much later on. If Orthodox communists still remember Pannekoek and Gorter as revolutionary thinkers, it is merely because Lenin's diatribe against, quote, "ultra-leftist folly," end quote, has perpetuated their names and caused them to endure like flies encased in amber. But although they were defeated in the controversy of 1920, they may prove, after all, to have been more perceptive than their victorious opponents in seeing the significant trends of their time. At least they had fewer inhibitions in stating their views on the connection between economic backwardness and revolution. A recent study on Leninism has claimed that what it calls the, quote, "dialectic of backwardness," end quote, forms an important aspect of Leninism. If it does, The credit for first formulating this principle of Leninism belongs to Anton Pannekoek. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.